Ulysses S. Grant was once one of the most underrated and underexplored figures in the 20th century America. He was called a butcher, a drunk, and corrupt. Today, we are fortunate to have the Frank Scaturro here on our channel. He is a historian, lawyer, author, and personal friend of mine. He is best known for saving Grant's tomb in the early 90s, and he brings to light its neglect from the national park over many years. And he courageously lobbied congressmen and others to vote on a measure to post ominously promote Ulysses S. Grant to the rank of General of the Armies of the United States. Today, we will explore many of the myths that surrounded Ulysses Grant as president through some of Frank's work in Grant Reconsidered and Grant at 200, both of which I highly recommend you all buy and read. I am the dramatic historian, so let's get into it. Frank, I feel very grateful to have you on our channel, and it is a wonderful honor to have you on.
Thanks. It was so good to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, I actually, before we actually really kind of dig into everything, I want to just talk a little bit about your journey. I mean, that being, when was the first time you actually heard about Ulysses S. Grant? How did you learn about Grant's tomb? Especially given the fact that it was very unpopular when you were probably growing up, would be my guess. And then what made you so interested in him and trying to protect his tomb?
Well, I couldn't say I remember the first time I heard Ulysses S. Grant's name, but I can tell you the origin of my interest. It came from a broader interest that I had in U.S. presidents that began when I was 7 years old. And that started when my parents bought the World Book Encyclopedia set, and I just explored that set from A to Z. And when I got to the P volume, the president's article, it just fascinated me to read about all of these men who had served in that position as president of the United States, from George Washington to, at that point, Jimmy Carter, to give you a sense of how old I am. Um, he was the current president at the time. I devoured not only the individual articles on presidents in that World Book Encyclopedia, but also every juvenile biography I could on. But there wasn't any singling out of Grant at that moment. That was my entry to what broadened into an interest in American history, U.S. government, Constitution, also the Supreme Court would later become focuses of mine. But it really kind of started with the presidents. And as I devoured everything I could over the course of years in grammar school, by the time I was between the ages of 12 or 13, it wasn't a sudden process, it was kind of a gradual one. There were several presidents who stood out as perhaps misunderstood, maybe underappreciated, particularly worthy of our attention, positive attention. In addition to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, there were three others. There was Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, and Dwight Eisenhower, all of whom kind of struck me that, well, you had these amazing lives of military careers followed by 2 terms, or in Teddy Roosevelt's case, it was virtually 2 terms he filled out, considered among the greatest to have served in their respective positions. And the more I read about this, and this came out at a time when Dwight Eisenhower's reputation was actually improving in the mid 1980s. He went from someone who initially, in these silly polls to rank the presidents, which I could talk about in greater detail if you'd like, was initially considered a pretty mediocre president, but he starting with this reconsideration of the mid 80s, his star began to rise. He exercised what's often known as hidden hands leadership. Teddy Roosevelt, as illustrious as his career was, yeah, he had a very highly publicized military career, but it's not really something that's in the same category as either Grant's or Eisenhower's military career. And of course, his presidency was quite highly regarded. He typically was, if not in the very highest echelon of presidents, very, very close to that. But it did strike me that you had figures who could excel both, that like the same person could excel both in the military realm and in the presidential realm. Now, as soon as I'm saying that, you may say, well, stop for a moment. How can you suggest that a Ulysses S. Grant excelled in the presidential realm? Well, of course, the initial thing you encounter when you look at the literature, the traditional consensus of 20th century historians, you'll still see a bit of it now, depending on what you read and how old the material is. But if you're going to school, as I was, 1980s, you still have literature that regards Grant as an awful president. However challenged Dwight Eisenhower's political reputation was, it was nothing like Grant's, who was just completely in the basement. He was second only to rock bottom Warren G. Harding in these polls to rank the presidents. Grant is the worst in the first couple of Arthur Schlesinger polls, 1948 and 1962. And then there was another poll in 1982, the Murray Blessing poll, in which he wound up in the same place. And the more I read about his public career, and it started, interestingly enough, more with Grant's presidency than with his military career, because there was this focus that I had on the presidency. That's a different path from virtually everyone else I've encountered who has embarked on a lot of Grant's scholarship. They nearly always start with the military career, and I've since come to be very much interested in his military career, without a doubt. But first thing that really got me going was that I couldn't quite understand how he could have been rated as low as he was. Like, what was the basis for it? The works that I read on him, and some of them were the juvenile biographies that I referred to, but I also was reading other works like William Heseltine's Ulysses S. Grant, Politician. That was one of the first full-blown adult, books for adults on Grant's political career. For that matter, it was one of only two comprehensive works that were devoted exclusively to Grant's political career that were even published prior to Chuck Calhoun 9 years ago. So I was reading through these books, and you read about supposed depressing, corruption all over the place and a low level of statesmanship, but you read more and more about these Gilded Age character sketches that have, if you look at them closely, they have little to do with the actual presidency. They're not about the administration, they're not about policy matters. It's just about kind of stirring up this aura that things were corrupt, that things were bad, that things were even oppressive, and trying to tar Grant with those labels. And as I'm reading all of this stuff, you will look, even in the literature of that time, I was encountering here and there, well, what's that? There's actually a domestic or a foreign policy achievement, something that gets so little attention, while these other issues that seem to be pretty divorced from the question of presidential leadership get the emphasis. And then, of course, Reconstruction itself was seen as this horrible, oppressive thing. Even though I grew up after, I was, for that matter, born after the civil rights movement had already ended, it took a couple of generations afterwards for the change in the country's attitude toward civil rights and voting rights to actually transform the way historians treated Reconstruction, the post-Civil War era. And all of those issues tied into Grant's low standing. The myth of the lost cause, which in the case of Reconstruction You had the Dunning School was kind of an aspect of the myth of the lost cause that focused on smearing that post-Civil War period and everyone who led the country to advance these policies as just this horrible, horrible thing. And historians still had not gotten that out of their system when I was starting out. So I had had this interest that came from gradual reading, but by the time I was in eighth grade, I guess, graduated from grammar school, I had really singled out Grant from the others, even from the three that I mentioned, as someone who was uniquely misunderstood, underappreciated, and I continued with that interest. I continued exploring, and still, the more that I read, the less I could understand or appreciate Grant's awful presidential reputation. And then when I came to explore in greater detail his military career, and his star was already rising. Frankly, it was already rising even before I was born, the days when Bruce Catton was writing his classic works. But even there, you had someone who was battered by historians through much of the 20th century, whose whose ability as a general, whether it was on a tactical level or a strategic level, widely misunderstood, denigrated in favor of the Confederates who opposed him. Well, there was an emerging consensus at the time. There was this other revisiting, this broader revisiting of the Civil War Reconstruction era, that Grant was very likely the greatest captain America ever produced, if you look at the pantheon of great military leaders in our history. And that leaves me thinking, well, just how much more remarkable this career is, this life is, that one man was able to achieve what he did in both realms. If you look back, when I was 7 years old, I actually, on my own, decided to do a project. Teachers didn't ask me to do it in the second grade, but I did a project on the presidents where I would do a write up and I would trace on construction paper their picture nearly always, if not always, from those World Book Encyclopedia articles. And if you look at what I wrote at age 7, the president who got by far the most attention, the most coverage, was Abraham Lincoln, who I, of course, continued to regard as belonging in the highest pantheon of great American leaders. By the time I was in high school and then in college, moving on to all of that, Grant had taken that place of having, occupying the most emphasis, the most focus in my, call it, scholarly work or budding scholarly work. Now, when I went to college, it was just a coincidence, you could say a happy coincidence, that the college that I attended, Columbia, happened to be a few blocks away from Grant's tomb. A number of people that I've known in years since who encounter me in connection with that monument have asked, or they had the impression that my interest in the tomb and my involvement in it was the genesis of my scholarly interest in Grant. But in fact, it went the other way. It was the other way around. That I started with the scholarly interest, and quite literally, the first thing I did after I had moved my stuff into my dorm was to go walk over to Grant's tomb and talk to staff there to see if I could get a job, any sort of job. And I was thinking of something part-time, of course, since I was, after all, a student. And they, the staff there, eventually took me on as a volunteer. And then there's a whole other story of encountering National Park Service bureaucracy, the conditions at Grant's tomb, and what became a historic preservationist undertaking. Completely separate track from the history writing. But while all of that was going on, when I had the chance for my various courses, and I was a history, political science double major, I had opportunities in my studies in both of those fields to write papers on different aspects of Grant. And my undergraduate thesis, my history thesis, I should say, was the basically the genesis of President Grant Reconsidered. President Grant Reconsidered, the book that I published years after that. It's a short book, but that's actually an expanded version of an undergraduate history thesis. So there you go. And that wound up being published after law school, as it turned out. The first edition came out in 1998. But yeah, that's basically a very long-winded explanation of how the interest started, and it's something that, of course, continues all these years later.
Well, we can definitely end it talking a lot about the rankings, the presidential rankings, because I do find that stuff really, really interesting. And your point about Teddy Roosevelt, especially kind of naming or putting Grant in this great pantheon of, you know, presidents, I think is a really kind of fascinating study itself. But really, the one thing I wanted to try to understand, and you actually started talking a little bit about this related to some of the histories that came out about Grant's presidency, is this idea of corruption that existed within the Grant presidency. It seems that every time any argument always gets brought up about Grant's presidency, one of the ongoing, I'll call it one of the ongoing myths or misconceptions is that Grant took part in the corruption and that he hired his own friends into the government. So he was, fully exploiting a kind of the spoil system. But I actually wanted to get your view on that and your understanding of that, that contextually explains how Grant was actually not personally involved in those matters.
Yeah, the corruption narrative, as I call it, is the notion that a fundamental defining component of Grant's presidency is the role of corruption. And it happens to be a multi-layered issue, and one that historians tend not to appreciate when they're writing about it in modern times, or even, of course, in earlier times. So much of what was handed down as the negative verdict of Grant's presidency was, in fact, the recycling of what Grant's contemporary opponents were writing against him. And much of what was called corruption during Grant's time was merely the practice of the spoils system, which you made reference to. That's the use of partisan criteria in the distribution of appointments. And that's a system that had been in place for generations. And it was used extensively by Grant's immediate predecessors, notably including Andrew Jackson and Lincoln himself. And while Grant would use patronage power to secure his goals, he would also take some pioneering steps to rein in the system and to introduce reforms to the largest and the most troubled realms of government, like the Treasury Department, the Interior Department, the Post Office Department. But that's not all that this corruption issue is about. There was more when you cut through the various layers of what Grant's contemporaries and later historians were really writing about. A major part of the definition of corruption that Grant's contemporary critics held was his Reconstruction policy. The notion that Reconstruction itself was really corrupt. It was deemed a threat to what Gilded Age reformers viewed as the Republican ideal. And there's a lot that's been written on the Gilded Age reformers, those who champion civil service reform. We need to get rid of the spoils system and replace it with meritocracy, which all sounds great. And there actually were aspects of the civil service that were in bad need of repair, not sprung up instantly in 1869 when Grant was inaugurated, but something that had been festering for quite some time. The other side of that coin was this idea that, well, government must be by the best men. And of course, at this point, we're talking almost exclusively about men in the highest levels of power, although Grant did wind up making a number of appointments of women to be postmasters, a whole other thing. But the the notion that the Republican ideal was somehow threatened by what was going on during the Grant years, that was a big component of what was happening. If you can fast forward to no less than C. Vann Woodward, who some consider the greatest historian of the 20th century, he wrote a scathing article in American Heritage magazine in 1957 called The Lowest Ebb, where he called Grant's administration basically the lowest ebb of statesmanship in American history. And he said in this article that corruption may have been the most conspicuous, or excuse me, Reconstruction was the most conspicuous form of corruption during the Grant years. By the way, Woodward would flip flop like more than one time in what he was writing about Grant. We can get to that later. But sticking for a moment to this issue of corruption, in 1872, you had a situation that was really unusual in the history of presidential nominations. A component of the Republican Party, those calling themselves liberal Republicans, they broke away to form a liberal Republican Party to nominate their own candidate for president in 1872. They could not endorse Grant for another term in the White House. And if you look at what they were all about, there was a lot of denunciation of corruption. That was a really prominent feature of their nominating convention that they had when they nominated Horace Greeley, a man who himself had actually had a history of not only supporting the regular Republican Party, but you can call him accurately one of its founders and someone who had been an opponent of slavery, but was changing as Reconstruction was going along. The interesting things about this movement and the denunciations that came about in 1872 is at the time there had not been a single revelation of corruption, what we would call corrupt activity, malfeasance, breaking the law with malicious, with malice, with moral turpitude, if you will. There had not been a single instance of this exposed in the upper recesses of the Grant administration. Not one of his principal appointees had been exposed as being corrupt. But there was still this notion that, oh, there's this thing called corruption, and it somehow defines this administration, and we have to oppose it in favor of a reform platform. The other side of that coin, Reconstruction, they thought was becoming too harsh, even though Grant, with his swift and decisive action in the realm of Reconstruction, which we can talk about, helped eliminate the earlier explicit opposition to voting rights for the formerly enslaved people, basically the 15th Amendment that Grant was instrumental in getting ratified, bans racial discrimination in voting. Well, that takes off the table the notion that, well, only white people should be able to vote. But the enforcement of the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, for that matter, which often involved the use of military, the reformers deemed that to be oppressive, militaristic. They thought they accused the president of Caesarism, and there was even a fear that Grant would never leave office, that he would try to remain in office and not limit himself the way George Washington had. And this paranoia, and this would in many ways, including in the case of Horace Greeley himself, it just kind of a strange turning against civil rights, even among so many who had been against slavery, which Grant had not been, of course, prior to the Civil War. Grant was no abolitionist, but there were those who were, in fact, abolitionists who went so wobbly on Reconstruction, not just wobbly, they were starting to be outright opposed to criticizing in harsh terms the measures that were being used to protect these rights. And the notion that, so you have this criticism of corruption that is out there. It's front and center. Charles Calhoun, in his book about the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, which came out in 2017, actually does a good job of pointing out how these criticisms came about even before Grant had placed his hand on the Bible. There was this sense that a good number of these elite reformers had it in for Grant. They thought that they and their friends or people that they thought fit their, you know, like-minded people or people from their social stratum should have had more power in the government than they did. And Henry Adams was most prominent among these critics who, when Grant was still president-elect, seemed to be relishing the chance to criticize him and to cast his administration as this degenerate one for the kinds of imagery that I've been referring to. And you don't have, until you get to Grant's second term, you don't have anyone among Grant's principal appointees accused of what I think an even broad notion of a broad definition of corruption would cast as okay, this is corrupt activity. And then when you look at those particular instances, you find that well, the actual criticisms, the people that were that critics raised questions about, you actually wind up with either no they're there or maybe lapses in judgment that fell well short of the sort of indictment that you would expect to fuel a condemnation based on corruption. But before you get there, you can have something like in 1869, there is an attempt by Jay Gould and Jim Fisk to corner the gold market. You have Black Friday that comes about, where they're trying to persuade the president to change the government's policy on the sale of its gold so that they will succeed in this scheme to corner the gold market. Well, Grant winds up foiling their plans. He never buys into their attempts to get him to talk about, okay, this is what we're going to do, never, let alone get going along with this at all. Grant's administration, the president, with the assistance of his able Secretary of the Treasury, George Boutwell, wound up ruining their plan so that Black Friday, as it was known, did not develop into a broader financial depression. But historians' take away from that is merely to categorize this, to catalog this episode as, oh, there's our first Grant scandal. And, scandal is a legitimate term when you're talking about troubling conduct, things that people are doing that they shouldn't be doing. If you want to set a high bar for ethics in government, right? But scandal could also be a weasel word if you keep it in the realm of amorphous, impressionistic notions that, well, something's going on that we don't approve of, but without really getting to the nitty-gritty of what particular subordinates were doing and whether there was actual guilt or criminal liability even that attached to it. I contrast this attitude that historians have taken with the Grant administration with the attitude that they've taken in the case of every other president, at least every other president not named Warren G. Harding or Ulysses S. Grant, that they never, ever, in these other cases, will cast a presidency, will define a presidency primarily on the misdeeds of subordinates. And in fact, a lot of people don't know this, but there was a report on executive misconduct that C. Vann Woodward spearheaded during the Nixon impeachment inquiries in 1974, in which Woodward gathered a whole bunch of historians to compile what we already know about the misdeeds of presidents in the past. Members of Congress wanted to see what the historical comparisons were as they were exploring Nixon's misconduct. And we don't know much about this. We don't hear much about this survey because Nixon resigned before the impeachment process played out and before this study was released. But it was released with little fanfare. And years later, one of the historians who worked with Woodward, James Banner, actually edited and updated a version of this study to take it through the Obama administration in 2019 when the updated version was public. And Banner made an interesting remark with respect to the presidency of Harry Truman. He said to write the history of presidencies through misconduct is completely to misconstrue the nature of presidencies. Let's take this is, I'm still quoting from him now. Let's take Harry Truman's presidency as an example. Truman's presidency was one of the most corrupt in the 20th century. And then Banner, he went on to talk about how the real story of the Truman presidency consisted of policy issues like the Berlin airlift and the Marshall Plan. And here's another direct quote: if you try to write the history of the Truman administration on the grounds of the misconduct of the White House, then you're not really writing the history of the Truman administration. Well, in the case of Grant, you have historians who are, in fact, writing histories completely through the prism of what they see as the misdeeds of Grant's subordinates. But okay, I'm talking now myself in general terms. Why don't we look a little bit more at the specifics? And again, these are things that are only even coming out in Grant's second term, despite the fact that this liberal Republican movement had already broken away and not only nominated Greeley, not only, rebelled very openly from the Republican Party, but they nominated a candidate that the Democratic Party would nominate. It's like the only time in our presidential history, the history of nominating presidents, that a major political party basically piggybacked on to the choice of a third party, in this case, the Democrats, going along with the liberal Republican Party's selection of Horace Greeley. And by the way, that did not prevent Grant from winning the biggest landslide that the country had seen between Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt. And this was at a time when the country rarely saw landslides. The electorate was quite close to being deadlocked. It was much closer to parity, kind of more similar to today than during other periods when one party seemed to be really dominant. But okay, let's look at Grant's principal appointees, or its cabinet members or other principal appointees. Well, Grant had an attorney general, George Williams, who actually had a really strong civil rights record, one of the strongest in the history of the Justice Department, which, by the way, was itself an accomplishment of Grant, that the Justice Department was even created in 1870. Well, George Williams had bought a fancy carriage that he used and his wife used for social calls, and he negligently allowed the Justice Department's chief clerk to handle his personal accounts in a way that effectively resulted in improper advances in pay. But these lapses were common and they did not lead to personal profit. Now, Williams's wife may have been another story, and she may have also been someone who, in fact, we have much reason to believe that she was mentally unstable, especially if you look at her later years. A lot of parallels, interestingly, to, if you talk about Abraham and Mary Lincoln had engaged in conduct that you could only call corrupt. It was not just her exorbitant taste in trying to furnish the White House, but actually fueling false bills from the Treasury to feed these habits, and even engaging in petty bribery, things that, of course, Abraham, we don't think, had any knowledge of. But just imagine how different historians would have approached any similar fact pattern if you were talking about Ulysses and Julia Grant. I mean, we know how horribly besmirched their reputations are without anything like that, with really squeaky clean ethics, throughout. Grant had another cabinet member named William Richardson, his second Secretary of the Treasury, who had negligently signed off on an opportunist's profitable and, as it turned out, unnecessary contracts with the Treasury Department to seek out delinquent taxes for a 50% commission. But Richardson had, in fact, been deceived on what appeared to be routine and inconsequential contracts. He was not looking to profit. He broke no law. Grant had a Secretary of the Interior, Columbus Delano, who was blamed for his son's attempt to profit off some shady surveying contracts where the son wasn't really doing work. He was kind of a silent partner in these contracts. But the secretary himself was an honest man. Now, Grant had a private secretary in the White House, Orville Babcock, who there you have some serious lapses in judgment. He was indicted for conspiracy in connection with the whiskey ring. Now, he wound up being acquitted, not contrary to some accounts, because Grant submitted a deposition in his defense. And by the way, there were a bunch of people who were vouching for Babcock, including General Sherman himself in Babcock's trial. But Babcock was acquitted because the evidence against him was just insufficient for conviction. I do think that he was, at a minimum, guilty of some serious lapses in judgment. He winds up communicating with revenue collectors in St. Louis who were themselves running much of the whiskey ring, this network of fraudulent whiskey distillers who were colluding with government officials to basically evade whiskey taxes in exchange for bribes. But this component of the Babcock prosecution, this notion that Babcock himself was out to engage in bribery, is a very weak part of the case. And in fact, Babcock, you can't say there were no consequences for this, because basically Babcock was demoted to a position as inspector of lighthouses. He was out of the White House after the whiskey ring trial was over, but he remained on the payroll during the presidencies of the next three Republican presidents. And in fact, Rutherford B. Hayes had told Babcock that people had lied about him. And Chester Arthur actually nominated Babcock for a military promotion before he wound up dying by drowning on the job. These facts tend to be excluded because, well, if you bring all of these facts into the picture, it undermines the idea that, number one, Babcock was certainly guilty of knowingly committing a crime and trying to advance this whiskey ring fraud. But also, you have to get rid of all of this other context because it undermines the idea that Grant must have been stupid or a terribly poor judge of character. No, in fact, Babcock's acquittal, even for many who were enemies of Grant, they understood that there just wasn't sufficient evidence for it. And that verdict, when it came down, was not something that was widely seen as an unjust thing. Now, you do have, among Grant's cabinet members, I think you're down to one cabinet member, William Belknap, as Secretary of War, against whom you can present a strong case for malfeasance. What appeared to be bribes that his wife had arranged in connection with a lucrative Indian post tradership. But contrary to the notion of Grant as blindly sticking to corrupt subordinates, and that's part of this reputation of trying to tie Grant to corruption. Well, Grant very quickly accepted Belknap's resignation, but that didn't stop a rabidly partisan Democratic House of Representatives from impeaching Belknap anyway. And one of the really baseless criticisms against Grant was that, well, he accepted his resignation so quickly because he wanted Belknap to escape the consequences of an impeachment trial. And that's a criticism that is in stark contrast to the way every other presidency is approached when it comes to subordinates who've engaged in potentially impeachable conduct. There actually was no case until the aberrational case of Mayorkas, the Homeland Security's impeachment a few years ago. Aberrational for its own sort of separate reasons. There was no other instance in American history when a cabinet member or any other executive branch appointee was impeached. And in no other case did a president held delinquent for not keeping potentially impeachment-worthy subordinates in office in order to subject them to the impeachment process. And additionally, Grant had ordered his attorney general to prosecute Belknap. One of the problems, one reason the prosecution didn't amount to very much, is there was reasonable doubt all over the place about Belknap's criminal liability. His wife, his late wife, who had arranged these sketchy payments, uh, well, she had died, and there was certainly evidence of her intent to engage in bribery. And I happen to think that there's reason to believe that Belknap was at least looking the other way, maybe negligent when it came to this stuff. The evidence fell far short of what you would have needed to have convicted him. And there actually was a sitting Supreme Court Justice, Samuel Miller, who vouched for Belknap during his impeachment trial, vouched for his character. Belknap had defenders from some pretty respected people, and to this day, well, both Belknap and Babcock are actually buried in Arlington Cemetery, and the Belknap instance, far from being, well, and should have seen this deficiency of character on the part of his subordinates, it really was shocking that Belknap even would have been involved in something like that. And from what a main witness, the guy who was paying the money out, had said of Belknap's late wife, he had said that she had said, well, when she was arranging this thing, don't tell my husband about this because someone once tried to do something like this, basically suggesting a bribe, and Belknap threatened to like throw him down the stairs. So the notion that you know corruption somehow uniquely and distinctively attaches to Grant, it's baseless. But you have all of these layers of historical misunderstanding, and you have these things that critical. Why is it that it stuck so much? Well, you have to understand the civil service reform movement that later took off. Now, Grant was not oblivious to the notion that the civil service you needed to change the way you did business, the way you staffed the executive branch. You can't just be doing political favors for people, or acceding to what members of Congress want you to do. And he did take steps getting together an early system where you would assess applicants based upon their merit. There actually were, this is even apart from more lasting reforms that were taken in the biggest departments of the executive branch that I mentioned before, where competitive tests were implemented, or other standards in which you didn't want political hacks to be selected to government. But uh, this wound up fizzing out. Congress had no interest in funding the Civil Service Commission after 1875, and Grant himself thought this may not be accomplishing as much as people were suggesting that it was. In later years, Grant would point out that, well, you have people who could be selected by this less political system who could still wind up engaging in misconduct. And there was a problem that contrasted with that of the situation in Great Britain. And the civil service system in the United States was largely borrowed from Great Britain. But Grant had said in one of his post-presidential interviews, he said, well, the problem here is the second best men too often are seeking these positions in government. It's hard, he didn't put it quite this way, that it's hard to get the very best, most qualified people to get these positions. And also, he had a sense, which I think is a correct one, that the president has this prerogative. He has the final word on who occupies these positions. And the civil service reform that took place during his presidency, even though the commission itself wound up fizzing out, the statutes that were in place actually affirmed presidential authority to set the rules of these appointments that outlasted his presidency and were even stronger than some of the civil service statutes that came later on. But civil service reform becomes an issue with broad grassroots support when reformers very cynically and opportunistically took advantage of the tragic assassination of James Garfield by an insane man. Like Charles Guiteau is often described as an office seeker and a stalwart. the component of the Republican Party that were the regular Republicans, those who were skeptical of civil service reform, and those who actually were pushing for Ulysses S. Grant to come back in a non-consecutive third term in 1880. And the good guys, or the half-breeds, those as they were known, this is just the term that was used at the time. These were the ones who were in favor of civil service reform and getting us, beyond all the corruption. Or again, there's this notion, well, party bosses who like the spoils system and are skeptical of civil service reform must be innately corrupt. And unfortunately, this attitude stays with us. If you saw the Netflix series, I think Death by Lightning on James Garfield, although it in many ways as a dramatic production, I won't get into those things or how well acted it was, because there are many things that make it compelling viewing, right? But the notion that here were the good guys, they were pushing for civil service reform, and here were the ones who were against civil service reform, they were the bad guys, and look, the spoils system winds up leading to this tragic death of a president. Well, at that point, there was enough of a drive to do something to push the civil service reform agenda that you had a series of events that culminated in the Pendleton Act in 1883. And then if you go into the 20th century, you have this notion of separating the executive bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, from political control. That really takes off with the development of the progressive paradigm of government. And well, what do you know? Once this happens, inefficiency and dishonesty in government has become a thing of the past, right? Well, of course, it would be ridiculous to say that, but you would almost think that from the triumphalist history of the civil service reform movement, the history of this whole narrative about separating and depoliticizing much of the executive branch of government. Of course, in more recent times, well, not that we'll get into the weeds of any of this, there is a very important debate, I think, taking place about the need for accountability among those who are appointed to positions in the federal bureaucracy. And anyone who, if you look at the performance of government, there are very serious problems of both inefficiency and what an earlier age might call corruption. But the time that the two comprehensive works on Grant's presidency, pre-21st century at least, were coming out, 1935 and 1936, well, those were written respectively by William Heseltine and Allan Nevins. And I mentioned earlier, Heseltine had, his book was Ulysses S. Grant, Politician. Allan Nevins had a book ostensibly about Hamilton Fish, Grant's a very able Secretary of State, but the subtitle of the book was The Inner History of the Grant Administration. And it really was comprehensive in the detail it tried to present on Grant's presidency. But these books that coming out at the height of the New Deal not only were all in for this notion of the old corruption narrative and how this was the dark period that was awaiting the triumph of civil service reform. But also you have, at that time, Grant was the only Republican president who had served 2 complete terms in office. And I think there was an interest in casting him. There was a very partisan sense in contrast to Franklin Roosevelt, who was then president. This was the height of the New Deal. And what grist for this sort of narrative during the Great Depression to look at the supposed ravaging of society by Gilded Age robber barons, which itself is a narrative that is terribly flawed. It's not to say that there weren't problems, of course, during the Gilded Age that called for later correction, but the Gilded Age itself, politics of the Gilded Age, wrapped into this corruption narrative / civil service reform triumphalism. Well, you have that combined with the Dunning School, combined with the denigration of civil rights and voting rights. And Grant, it's like a perfect package of Grant seeming to be on the wrong side of history. because Grant's dedication to Reconstruction is not something that's elevating him during this period in which Jim Crow has prevailed in the South. Well, you have right there in a nutshell big problem with how historians had perceived Grant's presidency and the work the President Grant Reconsidered when I came out with that book in 1998. Most of the emphasis was on Reconstruction because I thought that was the most important aspect of Grant's presidency. If you because first number one, a premise of my view of presidents, any presidents, and I think we have to be judicious about how we view presidents. So you should look to policy, you should look to executive actions, look to what they actually did in office. That includes certainly any corrupt things they did, any abuses of power, but look at the actual domestic and foreign policy issues, how a president handled those, and your narrative of their presidency should be dominated by those issues. And here was, I think, the biggest issue, if you could argue that Reconstruction was in fact multiple issues because there were so many components from admitting the last of the former Confederate states that were under military rule still at the time that Grant entered the White House to then passing several acts, several measures into law to advance civil rights. At this time, civil rights is seen as is not being entirely synonymous with what voting rights. So you have to talk about civil rights and voting rights, even though in the present day we tend to collapse both under one umbrella. But you have all of these measures that Grant is pursuing. There is the promotion and the arm twisting that is needed of the 15th Amendment. And then once that's in place, well, what are you going to do? There's not a single statute on the books, certainly not from the age of Andrew Johnson, who was opposed to all these Reconstruction measures, and the 14th Amendment itself is only ratified in 1868 with the requisite three-quarters of the states that approved of it. Well, Grant is pushing through one measure after another to advance equal rights. There's the establishment of the Justice Department, which I mentioned earlier. There are 5 enforcement acts, which include the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a part of which, Section 1983, is probably the most important civil rights law on the books to this day, apart from provisions of the Constitution themselves, the Reconstruction amendments. But you have in 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 bans not only jury discrimination, but also becomes the first prohibition of segregation in public accommodations and transportation, the first anti-segregation law of national scope. And while all of this is happening, you also have Grant repeatedly intervening in the South, repeatedly using federal troops, but also using marshals, using this new Justice Department to protect voting rights and other rights of those who just a few years earlier had been enslaved. Well, this was a whole component of Grant's presidency that I thought, well, historians have gotten it so wrong, first in condemning so much of it, and then often in downplaying what Grant did. That got most of the focus of the 1998 book, President Grant Reconsidered. In 2023, so a quarter century later, the collection of essays we call Grant at 200 comes out. And the origin of this project was, there you go, Ulysses S. Grant's bicentennial in 2022 was approaching. And at one point I visited Stratford Hall, Robert E. Lee's birthplace in Virginia, and I saw in the gift shop there was actually a book of essays for the 200th birthday of Robert E. Lee in 2007. I was like, well, Grant should have a book of essays, right, with his approaching 200th birthday. So this is during the 2010s. And thanks to the Ulysses S. Grant Association, which then had John Marsalek was their executive director. He also wound up being a contributor. We got a really nice team of historians together, included Tim Smith, one of your guests
Yeah,
Um, there are so many Gary Gallagher and Joan Waugh who will be appearing for Grant's birthday at a Grant birthday dinner that the Grant Monument Association is going to have on April 27th in New York. Um, and a long list of scholars and people exploring different aspects of Grant's life and public career. But Chris Mikowski and I co-edited this collection of essays, and I had two essays in there. One was about Grant's tomb, but the longer essay, which was actually the longest essay in the book, which I suppose is a co-editor's prerogative to
sure.
allocate your more space, was to revisit Grant's presidential standing because it had been a quarter century since, or at that point, close to a quarter century since the President Grant Reconsidered came out. Book's publication date wound up being like right after 2022 was over, so it was like a perfect 25 years in 2023. But in that intervening time, a whole bunch of books had been written about Grant. You had, just to mention a few of them, Brooks Simpson, who was a really early and important scholar, a critic of William McFeely's Pulitzer Prize winning book on Grant from the early 1980s that had so many problems. Well, Simpson had called that out. You had other full, birth to death biographies that were coming out from Gene Edward Smith. You had H.W. Brands, Ron White, Ron Chernow. Joan Waugh had an important book about Grant in memory. I mentioned Charles Calhoun's book that was focused on Grant's presidency. These books had a very different presentation, a distinctively more sympathetic presentation of Grant's presidency. You saw no more of the Dunning schools bashing of Grant's Reconstruction policies, and also disappearing was a double standard, and Brooks Simpson was one of the first to call this out. But I mentioned C. Van Woodward earlier when he was attacking Grant in 1957 as this corrupt administration that was the lowest ebb of statesmanship. Well, that's not all that C. Van Woodward was saying. He was also uh, bashing Grant in 1957 as the tool of radical Republicans whom he called extremists. And he charged that, quote, Grant fell under the influence of the extremists and went over completely to their Southern policy, which disillusioned moderates. Well, then in 1981, when he's reviewing William McFeely's biography, and McFeely had actually been a graduate student of Woodward, that's a whole other question, pulling a review like that without being totally upfront about that relationship. Well, Woodward pulls an about face, and he then is attacking Grant for his supposed hostility. This is a direct quote: hostility toward the more radical war aim, for black franchise and racial equality, and blaming Grant for the abandonment of Reconstruction. This is a really curious thing that I found in the histories. Look at the age of Dunning. When Reconstruction was considered a bad thing, there was no doubt that Grant was really dedicated to it. And one of Dunning's students who wrote on Grant's Southern policy, Edwin Woolley, had written that Grant, he was just so stubbornly dedicated. He could see no other way that these amendments, like the 14th and 15th Amendment, they had to be enforced. He was critical of and it's kind of stunning when you think about it that a historical establishment would encourage violations of the law, not enforcing the law. But think about when they're writing. They're writing at a time when Jim Crow is doing precisely that in the former Confederate states. And so there's a sense that maybe you needed to develop an apologia for that to somehow rationalize and justify this abandonment of civil rights and voting rights. But at the same time, when people ever when they talked about Abraham Lincoln and what I think is the favorite what if question in all of American biography. What if Lincoln had not been assassinated? What if he had lived into Reconstruction? What would he have done? Well, that's a counterfactual question, and true history doesn't deal with counterfactuals. But what is fascinating to me is if you look at the history of how people approached Lincoln with that what if scenario, when Reconstruction was deemed a bad thing, what you would always hear is, well, Lincoln, if only Lincoln had stayed in there, he would have been more mild and moderate toward the South, more compassionate, not so vengeful, not so harsh as what happened under the radical Republicans. And that's kind of a euphemistic way of saying he wouldn't have really been pushing these equal rights agenda so hard. But then when after Reconstruction revisionism deemed Reconstruction to be a good thing, you had a, a really strange flip-flop of a kind that I just described with C. Van Woodward, where historians, there's a point during the 1970s and part of the 80s at least, when they're thinking, well, maybe Reconstruction collapsed because Grant wasn't so dedicated to it. McFeely wrote with contempt about Grant and his supposed racial attitudes. At the same time, Lincoln, once Reconstruction is a good thing, oh, well, of course, then we know Lincoln, if only he had stayed in the White House, he would have pushed equal rights with aggressiveness, with vigor. There was more of a focus on Lincoln's very last speech a few days before he was shot. And in fact, John Wilkes Booth was in the audience, and this is something that made him, I think, a martyr for equal rights. But Lincoln, in this speech, expresses his openness to at least limited suffrage for African Americans, at least some who had fought and were well educated, some who had fought for the Union and met what he saw as a certain uh, educational attainment. I'm not saying that's incorrect, but it's kind of interesting that the when the facts changed, one thing that didn't change for many years was this notion that whatever the right thing was, we know Lincoln would have done it, and whatever the wrong thing was, we know, well, that's what Grant did. Well, what we've kind of escaped from that, I think, the past quarter century plus, the reassessments that occurred starting in the really in earnest in the 1990s. And that's when the myth of the lost cause is really being battled on multiple fronts. Kind of interesting when you think about this is like 30 years after the civil rights movement that these realizations are kind of seeping into the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction broadly. But no longer is Grant tarred as a poor president for his record during Reconstruction. He's actually seen varying levels of praise and appreciation. You know, no two authors are exactly alike, but his war against the Ku Klux Klan has gotten a lot of coverage, a lot of recognition, and historians escape from, I think, that confusing flip-flopping of Grant's reputation that occurred initially as historians were trying to feel their way through that post-civil rights historiographical period, if you want to call it that, of the 1970s into the 80s. But there was still a problem. There's still what I observe to be a problem, which is that the corruption narrative has come to be still regarded as the second most prominent feature of Grant's presidency, when other aspects of domestic and foreign policy achievements that really deserve attention that they've not been getting, historians ignore them, and they too often will ignore them with impunity. If you look at the 20,000 foot, 30,000 foot summary of the Grant administration, how do you make sense of this administration? Today, as I said, no longer can a summary of the Grant administration be presented that omits Reconstruction or employs the Dunning era condemnation. But the same summary could be expected to, with impunity, the Alabama claims, the Virginius affair, And gold resumption, while it could not omit some form of the corruption narrative without seeming incomplete. And I think it might be the case that historians care about Reconstruction, but less so about other issues that have been distorted. And historians might not realize just how much distortions on other issues are the spillover effect of the polemic infused accounts from the years when the Dunning interpretation prevailed. Presidential historians who've not focused on Grant should have tried much more than they have to apply the same judicious approach to all presidencies.
The one thing that kept coming to my mind is you were talking was there was something that my father always used to tell me when I was growing up, and he always tell me in a very joking way. He would always say, "Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story." And it seems to be that, especially when it comes to Grant's corruption scandal, or the kind of this mythology around it, it seems that people have cared a lot more about the story behind it than the actual contextual facts. And is I think you wonderfully pointed out many of these stories of corruption go far beyond what most people consider corruption, even by today's standards, because they focus exclusively on, okay, well, this seems really odd, so therefore he's corrupt, without having those facts or the evidence available. And clearly, we see that with guys like Orville Babcock. I think we see someone that cares a lot about Reconstruction. He cares about equal rights. He establishes policies that are still used even to this day, and that's important. But because of whether it be the Dunning School or some of these histories that have been written, it seems that people have taken away more from all the criticism than the actual policies itself. And I really appreciate the fact, too, that you started chipping away at this notion that Grant is unique. He has histories written about him that are exclusive in axe grinding or trying to tear him down in some way that we don't see with other presidents. The Truman Library actually is not too far from me. It's in Independence, Missouri, and I've been there on a multitude of occasions, and they certainly don't mention the scandals or anything of that nature. Now, of course, I recognize it's a presidential library, but the fact of the matter is, how many biographies are out there about President Truman that focus only on that corruption? So, as we wrap up here, again, I want to let our audience know we are here with Frank Scaturro, and I highly, highly recommend you go get, whether it be Grant at 200. This is published by Savas Beatty, or Grant Reconsidered. Okay, this is, I believe it's published by Madison Books. But either way, I highly recommend you go get that. I think Frank does a wonderful job of explaining in significant detail Grant's rehabilitation as a president, as well as the story of saving the tomb. And it's a story that I think is supremely underrated. And I just want to thank you again for coming on and talking with me about Grant's corruption and kind of the myth behind that. But I want to also tell all of you, make sure to join us again next time. Hopefully with the next videos that are going to be coming out, it'll be more about the trip to my trip to New York City. I'll have some stuff posted then. But I am the dramatic historian, and whenever you need a fix for history, make sure to go over to History Fix, where you can indulge in everything related to American history. Have a wonderful Saturday, everyone.
Thanks so much.